Folks, now that we have a quorum, we're in public session. I just want to remind any members who participate in the meeting remotely need to do that within the Leinster House complex, as they well know anyway. Today we have going to discuss the employee experiences of technology surveillance in the financial services. Advances in technology have brought many opportunities for positive change in the workplace. However, developments in technology have also brought new risks and challenges that require appropriate scrutiny to ensure that the rights of businesses and staff are sufficiently protected through robust legislation and policy. One such area where workplace technology has advanced in recent years is in respect of technological surveillance of employees. So today I'm pleased that we have the opportunity to consider this and other related matters further with the following representatives from the Financial Services Union: Mr. John Connell, General Secretary, Financial Services Union; Mr. Brian McDowell, Head of Communications and Public Affairs, Financial Services Union; and Dr. Michelle O'Sullivan, Department of Work and Employment Studies, Kemmy Business School at the University of Limerick. Before we start, as I always do, I want to explain some limitations to parliamentary privilege and the practices of the Houses as regards reference you may make to another person in your evidence. The evidence of witnesses physically present or who give evidence from within the parliamentary precincts is protected pursuant to both the Constitution and statute by absolute privilege. Witnesses are again reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice that you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name in such a way as to make him or it identifiable, or otherwise engage in speech that may be regarded as damaging to the good name of the person or entity. Therefore, if your statements are potentially defamatory in relation to an identifiable person or entity, you will be directed by myself to discontinue your remarks. It is imperative that you comply with any such direction. The opening statements has been circulated to all members, and to commence the consideration of our matter, I now invite Mr. O'Connell to make opening remarks on behalf of the Financial Services Union.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Firstly, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to all the members of the committee who have facilitated the meeting today. I know the committee's schedule is hectic, so taking the time today to listen to the reports of workers in the finance sector on their experiences and attitudes towards technological surveillance by their employers is much appreciated by the FSU and by the staff working in the sector. Can I take a moment to introduce Dr. Michelle O'Sullivan from our research partners in the Department of Work and Employment Studies, Kemmy Business School, University of Limerick, who collaborated with us on this research. Without the work and professionalism of Michelle and the team from University of Limerick, this report would not have happened. This report was published just 4 weeks ago, but even since then, the developments over the last few months in AI have been dramatic. The advances in technology, and in particular over recent times, the creation of ChatGPT has brought technological advances in the workplace to a new level. Indeed, even 2 government departments have seen fit to use ChatGPT for a short while to see what benefits it might bring. It is claimed that recent developments in AI will transform our healthcare and education sectors. I mention this to emphasise the ever-changing nature of technology, the rapid advances that have been made, and to warn about the shortage of research on the benefits or detriments these advances may bring to the workforce and to workers. Workplace technology will advance and be enhanced over the next few years. It is vital research and legislation keeps pace with these changes so society, businesses and staff can both benefit and be protected from any unforeseen consequences. The FSU first commissioned this research in partnership with the University of Limerick in 2019 and again in 2021 with a follow-up survey carried out by the FSU in 2023. The research project sought to establish the experiences and attitudes of financial services employees to technological change in their job, and this report focuses on employees' experience and attitudes towards technological surveillance by their employer in particular. Globally, this took a massive leap forward as literally millions of office-based workers moved overnight to be home workers due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The findings are based on interviews conducted with financial services employees by the University of Limerick pre-COVID in 2019, followed by a large-scale survey of employees during COVID restrictions in 2021, with a further survey of members conducted in February 23. Surveillance of staff by the employers and how data is on staff is collected, stored and used was always an issue that needed to be addressed. However, it seems clear from these findings there is need for regulation and indeed legislation to keep pace with the changing nature of technology. A notable finding in the report is the extent to which respondents to the survey were unaware of the level of employer tracking and monitoring, with over half indicating they did not know if their office or home computer was monitored. Almost 1/4 of respondents reported that their employer had increased data collection on their work since they started home working, while 28% said data collection had stayed at the same level. 2/3 of respondents felt surveillance was demoralising and indicated that surveillance increased their levels of stress, while over half felt that surveillance at work was a violation of privacy. A majority felt that surveillance indicated a lack of trust on the part of their employer, 60%, while an even larger percentage at 63% felt that the use of surveillance erodes trust. Survey respondents reported having some experience of technological surveillance of their devices, but significant proportions were unaware if their devices were monitored or not. Interviewees spoke of varying levels of employee technological surveillance pre-COVID, from very little to very extensive, depending on where they worked and their role. And overall, employees had negative attitudes towards technological surveillance, viewing it as demoralising, stressful, and indicating, as mentioned, a lack of trust by employers. The report makes recommendations for employers and for the government. For employers, it is the view of the FSU that the concerns of employees evident in the survey findings can be addressed through collective bargaining between employers and trade unions. The FSU calls on employers to prioritise the following issues: providing evidence on the necessity and proportionality of technological surveillance in all its forms. That surveillance functions should only be introduced with the agreement of the union and affected employees. That the employer's collection of data from surveillance functions and the nature of its usage should be negotiated with the agreement of the union and affected employees, and to address with the union the impact of surveillance on employees, such as their stress and trust levels. And finally, providing evidence to the union on the organisation's cybersecurity measures to protect employee data collected, in particular biometric data. For government and legislators, Chairman, we would ask that this committee to commission a report into the use of surveillance in the workplace, with a view to exploring what, if any, legislative changes that may be required to best protect workers and provide for workers' voice on this issue. The research for the report would concentrate on possible legislative changes that may be required to keep pace with technological advances, whilst ensuring proper regulation of employers' collection and use of data from surveillance functions. This may involve stronger legislative mechanisms that support trade unions' access to and representation of workers for feedback on these issues, require employers to meaningfully negotiate with unions on technological surveillance, legislation regulating employers' collection and use of data from surveillance functions with the aim of ensuring procedural justice, distributive justice, interpersonal justice and informational justice within organisations, and empowering the Data Protection Commission to proactively inspect employments to ensure compliance on current GDPR legislation. Finally, can I again thank the committee for inviting us to address the meeting. I hope the committee members find the report insightful and worthy of consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Connell. I now want to invite members to discuss this issue with the representatives here. We have a roster in place. So the first person is Deputy Louise Riley, 40 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chairperson, and thanks very much to our witnesses. And specifically thanks for this report and for giving us the opportunity to have the discussion this morning. I think it's an important one. I also think it's something that has been happening quite a lot without any remarks being made about it, because there is something a little bit kind of, I'm going to say sneaky, but there's probably another word about it, but it has been sort of creeping in. So I have a couple of questions. I just want to say at the start, I have a speaking slot in the chamber, so I will have to leave a bit early. I apologise for that. I'll come back if I can. So yesterday, Bloomberg reported that the White House is hosting a forum for workers and whose employers use automated systems to monitor them, and they're planning a broader effort to ask Americans what priorities the government should pursue regarding AI in terms of new regulations on emerging workplace technologies. obviously the administration is seeking to better understand how companies use automated technologies. Do you think that a similar forum is needed here, or is there a danger that that could just become a talking shop, while actually what we need is to stop talking, accept the evidence and move on and move to legislate?
I honestly think it would be of benefit to have an open debate in terms of first establish what the floor is, what is the current level of surveillance that's taking place, and for employers to come forward and openly and transparently share with us in relation to that. But equally then, recognition in terms of your point in developing out of that is it's the pathway of you know where we go then and how quickly can we respond. What we would be afraid of is that we would end up like social media, that it has gone so far so fast that by the time we're legislating and regulating that it has moved away from us, and that the entities, whoever they may be into the future, are all powerful, like social media companies are today. Yeah,
and that is the danger, isn't it? That this has already started, as I say, and goes largely unremarked, and that's, you know, I mean, I know that some people have, Dr. O'Sullivan, I know that you have and others have been talking about it, but in the broader sense of discussions at the level of the workplace, even beyond maybe workers talking to themselves and saying, well, what do you think that means, and how much information do you think they have? I don't think we've had that broader conversation, and I don't think we did with social media, and it got kind of ahead of everything. I think you make a good point. I would be wary about something that would be a talking shop that might interfere with the regulation that might necessarily be needed, but I think we do need to establish what the levels are in the first instance. Now look, we all know workers have been surveyed, and there's been surveillance on workers since the Industrial Revolution, clocking in, clocking out. When I worked with a former union official, myself and Paul would know we clocked in and clocked out on our phones. When we did, I didn't consider it surveillance. I did sometimes wonder that nobody looked at the hours that were worked, and it's kind of invoked the old European Working Time Directive for me, but that never happened. It's unlikely to happen for yourselves either. But just in terms of, you know, employers now have a technological way to gauge what workers are doing without the knowledge of the worker to a large extent. And this, to me, represents a fundamental change. My employer knew when I came in, when I came out, you know, when I started, when I finished, and there wasn't a constant monitoring. But this is something now that AI in particular facilitates, is a constant monitoring, not just clocking in, clocking out for your break, clocking back in, you know, just took 16 minutes instead of 15 minutes. This is a constant monitoring. Specifically, what legislative changes would you like to see that would protect workers? So, I mean, nobody wants to interfere with an employer's right to know that the worker's doing their work. I mean, to me, the output tells you that, but if there is a burning need to do it, specifically, what legislative changes do you think we need to be looking at?
Well, thank you very much. I think there's two approaches. One is that first regulation has to address the question of whether actually monitoring should take place at all. There are legislation in other countries where, for example, there is very strict limits on the level of technological surveillance that can take place. For example, in Germany, legislation would say that employer monitoring of internet and emails can only take place where there's a suspicion of criminal activity. For example, in Portugal, biometrics can only be used, biometrics when we're talking about unique physical or behavioural characteristics of the employee, like fingerprints or eye scans, that they can only be used to record attendance or get access to buildings. Whereas we're all familiar here with waitresses and waiters using their fingerprints to access tills. Yeah. So legislation would first of all has to address, well, whether should be monitoring or not. If there is a level of flexibility given to monitoring, then a lot of international policy documents would talk about governance with worker representatives. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the European Agency for Health and Safety talks about co-governance with worker representatives on both the development, the acquisition, the introduction and the implementation of any kind of artificial intelligence systems. There's a whole range of difficult legal questions. So, for example, a lot of companies would buy in third-party software, and there's legal questions as to, well, who's responsible? And obviously a lot of legal scholarship would say that, you know, there has to be, in regulation, accountability to companies who are the employers of the employees, and not diverse responsibility to the software companies. There are more far-reaching proposals. For example, some law experts in the field of technology would argue that there should be a licensing of technologies involved in surveillance to ensure that they're compliant with employment laws before they're introduced into organisations. But most international policy documents would talk about co-governance of these systems. For example, that unions and worker representatives should be involved. I mean, we have GDPR and there is, you know, impact assessments, but that GDPR would not go far enough and it's not specific enough when it comes to employment relation issues. So should, for example, worker representatives be involved in the development of impact assessments? At the moment, there's no transparency about when companies have to develop impact assessments on data protection. The ILO Code of Practice on processing of personal data says that the extent of people's protections against risks of personal data depend on collective rights. I mean, I think it's important. I mean, there is a lot of developments at the EU level. I mean, the EU is developing an AI Act, and it would categorise employee monitoring through technology as a high-risk category. Okay. The difficulty with that AI Act at the moment is that it only places responsibility on the developer of the technology to assess themselves. Okay. So there's no emphasis on workers and very little on employers. Member states, you know, are a lot of them. I think, I mean, this is one of the first studies in Ireland about technological surveillance, so we're behind in terms of regulation.
Yeah, no, and thank you for that. And I think you're right in what you say in terms of us being behind, and that's why this research is so important, because at the very least, it's going to kickstart the conversations that we need to be having. I mean, I suppose the phrase "better late than never" is probably applicable here, but at least we are starting it. Can I just ask in relation to, so monitoring is more than just monitoring the number of keystrokes or the screen activity. It's gone very, very, very deep. So, you know, we know that there's a software that's capable of picking up keywords like interview, job search, you know, websites where you can access that. So this is this the level of surveillance now? Is it already much deeper than just monitoring the keystrokes? Is that already happening? And what kind of information are employers storing in relation to workers? Because obviously GDPR applies, and for the moment that seems to be pretty much the only protection that you have for your own data. But are employers, do you believe, using these monitoring tools and also collecting and storing data in a way that maybe, you know, they're monitoring the worker, but they're also keeping that information somehow without any guidance at all as to where it is being kept? Could you just give us an idea of the type of information that is being held and where it's being held, and, you know, just in terms of your broader experience even outside of the financial area?
First of all, yeah, I mean, I think John was right in mentioning what we need is more information on what is happening. As I mentioned, this is one of the first studies on surveillance in Ireland, and the level of surveillance depends very much on the organisation and the type of job that you're doing. So even within the financial services sector, some companies have invested enormous amounts of money on technology. And as you mentioned, the difference now is that the technologies, it provides constant and granular data in a way to before. The other difference with technology now is that it has the ability, in the past when you talked about the Industrial Revolution and so on, that a lot of automation up to now has been about the processes of work. Now it's about the management of workers and managerial decision making. So in some organisations, they, for example, in some banks that involve retail banking, there is an enormous amount of data collection, particularly all focused on sales targets. and that employees' work on every aspect of what they do is collected into scorecards, and in some organisations their conversations are recorded, both within the retail banks and obviously, you know, call centres. In other organisations, they have invested far less in technology and people have a lot more autonomy, but it depends on the occupation that you're in. I mean, internationally, there is growing, but not a huge amount of data on what kind of data is collected. A European Parliament resolution on mental health in digital world of work talks about 40% of HR departments in international companies are using artificial intelligence. And that can be anything from the hiring phase to the monitoring to the termination phase. So it varies. Obviously, in some organisations, for example, if you're talking about warehousing, you know, it's well known that people have PAM pilots which are attached to them in terms of tracking their productivity and what they do. So it varies a lot across organisations.
But the data, there's, without regulation, it's possible that some employers could be storing data without necessarily understanding how they should be doing it. Everything that you're saying just kind of points to the need for us to regulate this area fairly heavily. Just final question. My time is tight, but it's like I come from the perspective that workers are adults, right? We all know if you want to earn your wages, you have to do the work, and most people come to work to do their work either willingly or disgruntled because they're not multimillionaires or whatever, but you have to work, you have to get up, go into work, do your work, and most people understand that. But the level and the depth of surveillance now is, in my opinion, and I would welcome your views on this, is driving that always on culture. So we do need, I believe, to legislate for the right to disconnect, because what's happening now is people are being driven by the apps, driven by the surveillance, driven by the monitoring, and clearly employers believe they can get more productivity out of their workers. I don't know if that's proven. If the more monitoring you do, the more productive your workers are. I would doubt if that's the case, but if it is, I'm willing to be corrected. But like, the reasons why employers are monitoring, I suppose, are many, and some of them are doing it because they just feel like they feel like they should. But just in terms of the right to disconnect, are the two things related? Is the one without the other going to work, or do we actually need to have regulation plus the right to disconnect?
Yeah, I mean, they go together. I mean, there is specific regulations as well in other countries that talk about technological surveillance, and they also talk specifically about remote working surveillance and the right to disconnect. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and the two should go hand in hand.
Yeah, no, they are complementary, and I suppose we would have argued at the time in terms of in favour of legislation, but an assessment of the effectiveness of the code of practice could be part of it, because our feeling was that good employers will adhere to the code of practice, other employers won't, and it's the other employers that we're interested in.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, the ones that are doing the right thing are already doing the right thing, and perhaps the ones that aren't could learn from them. But my time's out. Thank you, Chair.
We now move on to the Fine Gael slot. 14 minutes between you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chairman, and welcome. And thank you for a most interesting piece of work, really fascinating and very timely as well. I've gone through it there in detail, and I must say that I'm in another committee here dealing with foreign affairs and defence. In the last number of months, we've been working on cybersecurity and hybrid threats and all that kind of stuff. And it's a whole different world, and it's moving so fast. So it's good that you brought this today, and for commissioning the research as well. It's a very responsible thing to do, and I think it's been very responsible. One small thing jumped out at me which I want to bring to your attention, and the question is the use of the word surveillance. Now, when I looked it up, one definition is it's close observation, especially of a suspected spy or criminal. So you've used the word monitoring. I came across the word oversight, and I just wonder if someone has asked, are you happy about being Are you happy about surveillance in your workplace? Whether the word itself is a little bit loaded. Now that's just one thing that struck me when I saw the word itself. But if the word was oversight or monitoring, I wonder would we have gotten the same kind of responses from the people that were questioned. It's just a comment. Now that's not at all to take from the value and the importance of what's here. I'm reminded, Chairman, of 1984 and George Orwell, and everybody being watched all the time, and there's been lots of work done in that space in media or in the world of media and film and so on over the years. But it's moving so fast now, and you've mentioned artificial intelligence on a few occasions, and again, I think somebody last week said that the development of artificial intelligence is going to be even more groundbreaking than the development of the internet itself. So that's pretty scary, and it's moving so quickly. I've looked at this chat, what is it, GTP or whatever it's called, and it's just unbelievable. When you put something in it straight away, it'll write an essay, it'll write a poem, it'll do all this stuff for you, no problem at all. So God knows what's happening. You mentioned a few times there co-governance with worker reps, and I think that's good. I agree with that. You also have been talking about the limitations of GDPR. Now, we've had GDPR mentioned a few occasions. That's having an impact as well on all of us. But you might maybe say a little bit more about the limit, how it pertains to this. Previously, we did a lot of work on the remote working and the right to request remote working and all that kind of stuff. You're probably familiar with that here, or we did a report on it. But one of the things that came up was that an employer has a responsibility for the safety of a worker at work, whether that's at home or in the office. And we're wondering how that might happen. And in one particular instance, it was said to us that the worker could take the employer on a virtual journey through his or her home to make sure it was safe. There's a whole area here about who's responsible for the safety of a worker. Have they got the proper chairs, proper desk? Is the workspace where they're working actually safe? So there's a certain amount of supervision and monitoring going on there, and there might be little tension in that. But I do feel, as you said, the idea of a code of conduct, as Louise just said a while ago, is important. But I think we have a lot of work to do to catch up, and it's moving so fast, it's moving away from us as we're working. As this place moves very slowly, as you know, legislation takes a long time to come through. I think you mentioned at one stage you did that workers didn't know if the computers were monitored or not. Now, if the computer is supplied by the employer, isn't there some form of responsibility on the employer to ensure that the computer is used for the purpose that it was supplied? In other words, that somebody wouldn't actually be doing private business on a work-supplied computer, or doing something illegal or immoral, for instance, on a work-supplied computer. And how does an employer ensure that nothing illegal happens? Because maybe the employer would be liable as well if something was going on with a computer that was supplied by the employer without having some form of monitoring, I'm not going to use the word surveillance, monitoring of the device in some shape or form. Yeah, okay, I just might leave it at that, give you a chance to come back on those few points, please, before because I watch for conscious of time when I come in again then.
Thank you for that. The issue of the definition surveillance is interesting. I think the definition can be different in employment relations as opposed to other fields, but monitoring and surveillance would have an interchangeable term in law and labour law and employment relations. We would have provided a definition in the survey to people so they would have understood that basically it was about tracking of employee performance, and then ask them specific questions on it. But that's an interesting issue. On the GDPR, there's a lot of debate about GDPR, and while it has taken obviously privacy and transparency a step further than what it was, that there are questions as to how applicable it is in the area of artificial intelligence in the workplace. So, for example, it mentions about automated decision making, but it doesn't. There's a legal question as to whether actually people have a right to an explanation about decisions that are from automated decision making. It doesn't mention, for example, there's a legal question about semi-automated decision making. It only mentions automated as if there's different levels of automation of decision making. There's a lot of, one of the criticisms of GDPR is that there's a lot of focus on the procedural aspects of what should be done as opposed to maybe the rights of workers. And things like I mentioned before, that there isn't, for example, there's no right to transparency over impact assessments that are conducted in the workplace. So there are some, I suppose, ambiguities as to its level of applicability in the area of artificial intelligence. In terms of monitoring and what employers are allowed to monitor, there's a whole range of issues. So when I mentioned health and safety, there's a really excellent report by the European Agency on Health and Safety about artificial intelligence in the workplace. And the issue, of course, of health and safety is quite broad. I mean, you're talking about, first of all, physical safety, but then you're talking about mental health now is a big issue when it comes to digitalisation and remote work. Things like bullying, like, for example, one of the supposed benefits of monitoring or surveillance in the workplace is that it might help reduce bullying. We asked, not everything is included in the report that we have. We asked a question in our survey for the Financial Services Union about, did employees feel that having extra surveillance or technological surveillance would help reduce bullying, and only about 11% of employees believed that it did. So first of all, you have to define as to what should employers be allowed to do. The big issue, of course, is that international documents that talk about the threats to employee privacy and autonomy, and that also comes into the area of health and safety. So it's not a given in international legislation that employers should be allowed to monitor. Like the examples I mentioned earlier about, there's in some countries very strict limits about any sort of level of monitoring, including remote surveillance. So, for example, in Portugal, there's strict limits on the level of technological surveillance and remote working. The other issue is that I think there is a legal question as to the legal basis upon which employers should be able to collect data on workers. Employers might be mistakenly thinking that having the consent of employees is enough as a legal basis, and there would be strong legal opinion that that's incorrect. That because of the inequality in power between employers and employees, that for example, the European Data Protection Board, which is responsible for monitoring data protection, it would say that there's never a situation in which employees can freely give consent to offering data. So that's an issue as well.
Thanks for that. Really fascinating. Have you engaged with the employers on this issue as a trades union?
I suppose that's the intention, is beyond the publishing of the report, is to engage employers. And in other areas where we've published reports and engaged with employers, we have got progress, right? But we do so, I suppose, in the absence of a legislative framework. And so for us, we would argue that the starting point is a report to see the extent of it. We know from the employee's point of view, what we don't know from the employer's point of view, to conduct a report into the extent of it. And then it's the, understanding the scale of it, and the legislative requirements that then need to come into place. And part of that legislation requirement is the issue of collective bargaining, is to empower workers to have that dialogue and to restore some of that power imbalance in that dialogue, in starting with transparency in terms of people being explained in plain language what is being monitored and why it's being monitored, and the legal basis of the monitoring.
In the absence of legislation or code of conduct or anything else, this whole area is, I get the sense from you that it's kind of drifting and developing on its own, and that it probably does need to have parameters put on it, which would actually include both yourselves and the employers working together, and ourselves here, in order to develop structures and boundaries, as you've done in Portugal, as you suggested, Dr. Sullivan, and other places. Sometimes quite often actually, when you make a phone call to whatever, you get this thing called calls are being monitored for training, and calls are being recorded for training and monitoring purposes. it often struck me that what happens to that information when it's recorded and the word is recorded, where does it go, who's in charge of it, and the issue of personal data and some of the stuff you might be saying on the telephone could be quite personal. And obviously it's also done for training purposes, it says, with respect to the employee, which could be good and bad, because if an employee is making a mistake and maybe treating a customer in a kind of a way that could be better, put it that way, there might be a room there for some form of oversight and training to ensure that the employee has a good experience with the customer, customer's a good experience with the employee. Could you comment on that space, or does this kind of follow as well a little bit from what you're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in those situations, like the call centres have long had significant levels of employee monitoring surveillance. So, some of them would be, that data would be used. I can't say about what the data is used for in terms of the customer side of things, but on the employee side of things, I mean, for some people it's down to the tone of their voice is commented on. If they mention...
But sorry, that could be important in some instances if you're relating to a customer. If the tone of the voice is aggressive or argumentative, it could actually lose business and everyone is impacted. So, would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, I mean, there's benefits to technology in terms of helping quality of work, and it depends what job you're in. But there can be as well an excessive level of monitoring, and I suppose the question is, well, we don't know what the rights of the worker in that situation are. So if, for example, they go off script, for example, we did interviews as part of the study, and one of the examples from a bank manager is that with customers who come into banks now, they're often either people who don't have access to the internet or find it very difficult. And some employees might go to great lengths to try to explain to them what the services are, but if their conversation is recorded and they're found to go off script, they can be disciplined for that or receive a heightened level of monitoring when they feel that they're trying to help the customer as much as possible. And that's when, for employees, employees want to give a good service. And in some of the interviews that we did, they feel that the technology is working against them. Or that it's not there to help the customer as much as it could do. And that's what they want. They don't mind technology that helps them in their work. But when it works against them and they feel that it's leading to inefficiencies and to unwarranted disciplining, that's when they're extremely concerned.
Okay, and obviously the initial training isn't up to standard. If somebody's put into a job without proper training at the very beginning, then that can actually have an impact as well. Okay, listen, thank you very much for your remarks and for your feedback. It's extremely interesting, and I think that we have a fair bit to go on. Perhaps we should ask the employers in maybe in a little while when they have a chance to digest this and get their views. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Now, Deputy McBarry, 7 minutes, followed by Senator Marie Sherlock for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. It's a very interesting subject, and I think some of the conclusions of the report are dynamite. I would support the progressing of legislation on this. But I note the point that has been made about consent, where you have a huge power imbalance. Sign the contract if you want the job, you consent. No, I don't consent, you don't get the job. Which would point towards the need for workers to organise and to join unions to make sure that any legislation is actually respected and implemented. I also think there have been very interesting points raised about debates on how to meet this challenge from the point of view of regulating to the idea of coming close to banning. It would seem to me, from the example of Germany, I want to revisit that. But before I do, to ask, and I also support the proposal that we Commission report, I want to start with some questions for Dr. O'Sullivan. Can you tell us how many people were surveyed as part of this? And do we have any rough idea, broad brushstrokes, as to how many workers in society are being affected by this at the moment?
Thank you. The survey had just over, we had Two surveys. So we had one survey in 2019, which was part of a broader survey that the FSU did, and we did a few questions relating to surveillance on that, and that would have had over 1,000 responses. And then the main survey from which this data is taken from was just over 1,000 responses as well, and we did 23 interviews as well with people in different occupations like IT specialists and bank managers and so on. In terms of wider data, it's very limited in Ireland. I haven't seen other data in Ireland about the extent of surveillance. In other countries, I mentioned, 40% of HR departments in international companies using AI. A European Social Partners Framework Agreement on Digitalisation says that about 8% of companies are using machines to monitor performance. A CIPD, which is the HR professional body for the UK and Ireland, it had a survey in the UK recently, and they had that about 45% of employees indicated that monitoring of performance was taking place in their workplace.
That was in
the UK.
The UK.
Yeah. So that's the kind of data that we're talking about. Eurofound did some analysis of the European companies survey. They found that half of establishments are using data analytics for either monitoring employee performance and or improving processes or processes of work. This is a bit of a blurred area because, for example, if you take banking, you have, if you like, direct surveillance, which is, monitoring emails, for example, or monitoring internet usage. I don't think, for example, from what we've seen in financial services, much of the keystrokes being recorded or webcams. But it's, emails, logging in times, phone calls. But also, I mentioned the process improvement because sometimes you have indirect forms of surveillance. So, for example, you talk to an employee and they'll say, well, it's not that my performance is being monitored, but I'm filling out an Excel sheet, which is a part of a process improvement issue. And as a kind of an aside from that, my performance will be monitored as part of that process. So someone will come to me and say, well, you filled out that Excel sheet. I can see on the system that it took you X amount of hours to do it. Why aren't you doing it in less? So, they see it, so it also muddies the water for employees because they say, well, is my performance being monitored or am I just working on a system? Okay. But an offshoot of the system is that my performance is also being monitored as well. So we have varied levels. So we know that it's growing. We know some companies in other fields are using it to a great extent, but we've limited data in Ireland as to the prevalence.
Thank you. Maybe just another kind of short tranche of questions before I make my final point. Do we have any sense as to whether this is mainly people working at home or mainly people in an office environment? Can you take us through a little bit the different forms of surveillance? For example, you said webcams isn't major at the moment, but I mean, can you have a situation where someone is working at home and isn't even aware that they're being monitored by camera, which is seeing not just what they're doing at their desk, but what's happening in their home? Is that a potential thing? Is that happening in Ireland?
I suppose that the webcams was specific to this study in that in terms of the interviews and so on that we did, they didn't mention that, but it is technology that is available and can be used in other sectors. So the type of surveillance that can be used, you're talking about webcams. There is keystrokes logging, for example. It's difficult to know how extensive that is. There wasn't much evidence of that in the financial services sector that we looked at. You're talking about, if, for example, some banks will have systems that record every technological interaction, particularly like phone systems, logging in times, how long they're spending on calls, how long they're spending on emails, for how long. I mean, outside internationally, you're talking about other technology. For example, there's badges that can detect emotions, that can detect how you're talking to people. For example, one of the, I suppose, the most talked about examples is the Humanyze badge. It's HUMANYZE. And the Human Ease badge, basically, if every employee is wearing this badge, then it records every interaction that you have with other employees. There are some technologies, for example, there are some organisations in Japan where you can't enter a building unless you're smiling because they want to promote enthusiasm amongst employees. There is a very good American website, coworker.org, and it collects a database of all the technology apps that are available and the type of data that they collect. This is now known, I suppose, as little tech. Big tech would be like, obviously the Googles and so on of this world, but the little tech is what is the term being used to describe these a lot of startup companies which are developing these apps and software to record everything from your conversations to your emotions to your technological interactions.
Just very brief final point. It's interesting what you said about Germany. Germany isn't only a country which has a comparatively strong workers' movement, trade union movement, it's also a country which, at a certain point in the 20th century was under dictatorship, and then you had the experience in the east of the country with the Stasi, etc. So there's a real sensitivity around these issues in Germany. But it seems to me that what you described in Germany is that it's essentially illegal and banned. I mean, the one circumstance being if it's a criminal investigation, that's a real opt-in scenario. Whereas the other option is to say, well, okay, this is a reality, we deal with it, but it has to be covered by legislation, and there has to be collective bargaining, and we'll work out what can be done and can't be done in terms of consent. I have to say I would lean more closely to the German model, and I was just wondering if you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, the German model, the issue about criminal activity is specific to the monitoring of internet and email, but outside of that and other areas of surveillance of employees, there's strong co-determination rights, so that works councils have co-determination powers in relation to the introduction and use of technology to monitor work. So, countries like Austria, Denmark, Norway, France, these all have laws which are about co-determination or consultation of worker representatives with anything in regard to technology and monitoring of performance.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Marie Clark.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks very much to the FSU and to Dr. Sullivan for being here today, and to very much commend the FSU in terms of your work, because I think when I think back to 2020 and your work on the right to switch off, the right to disconnect then, in terms of setting the agenda then, and then very much in terms of this conversation today, I think, as part of this conversation, we're all very aware that the use of technology is transforming the concept of the workplace, and you're very clearly talking your recommendations about the need to rebalance, the empower balance in the workplace between workers and employers. But I want to just ask a little bit about technology being used as a management tool. So I think we have technology used for performance assessment, which is obviously related to management, but specifically to management. To what extent, perhaps, Michelle, you might be best able to answer this, but also in terms of the financial sector, to what extent is technology being used to manage now and thereby displace, managers, but that tool, are there, obviously I think the financial service sector is ripe for it to become a management tool, but are there other sectors as well where we're seeing technology displacing effectively physical people in terms of management?
Yeah, I mean, the financial service sector would be come out as one of the top sectors internationally in terms of the levels of technological surveillance of employees, and that's been found in, for example, Trade Union Congress survey in the UK, and also the EU agency on health and safety as well. The other one that would be quite high would be transport and storage.
Yes.
would be quite high as well. But definitely in banking, there's no doubt that the introduction of technology has been used to contribute to job losses. Some of the employees that we interviewed, for example, some bank managers would say that, in one particular branch, you might have a reduction of 5 people in bank tellers alone because of self-service machines. It's also part of the wider restructuring of banks, which John could speak more to in terms of downgrading as well, kind of the work that managers do, not high as, in some banks, not high as pay. But also as well, I mean, John can speak more about the efforts that banks are making in regards to employee well-being as well. Some sectors are much more ripe for technological displacement than others. Now, I mean, there is a benefit to technology as well. I mean, the employees that we talked about how, it's not for some people in some sectors, it's about wiping out of jobs, but really it's about displacing tasks.
Yeah.
As opposed to whole jobs. And for some of them appreciated technology in terms of trying to get rid of what they might term the more repetitive, boring work. But the other side of it is that while it has helped them to make work more interesting, it also leads to greater expectations about the quantity of work that they're able to do. So they feel that it has helped to, or enabled them, banks to increase the intensity and the pace of work. Sure. So that's the downside of it. But John can speak more about it.
Yeah, just to complement what Dr. Sullivan said, in terms of, the overriding principle has to be human intervention, right? So whether you're hiring people into the sector or performance management people, there has to be human oversight, and there has to be that pathway for workers to be able to have a conversation, because all the things that Dr. Sullivan is outlining are, the tools and the data that then feed into decision making. So if there is a bias in the system, it then propagates that on an ongoing basis with no human oversight, with no right of appeal, with no right of the... And it extends the limitation, so it doesn't have boundaries. So for our people who are working in call centres, and thousands of them who now work remotely, the boundaries aren't there that are in a physical space.
Yeah.
If we have a private conversation, it's a private conversation. If I have a private conversation with you and it's been monitored and I'm not aware, I can find myself in a situation of being performance managed or more serious than that as a result of that conversation. So if people don't know and they're busy, they can have interactions and conversations and so forth. So from our point of view, it is about human oversight in all forms, in terms of that no form of AI should have the independence to just operate with no human oversight. And how that is used then has to be subject to human interaction and appeal and oversight.
Sure. And then I suppose I just want to ask about the software then, and I suppose both to get the trade unions' perspective in this, your own experience, but also in terms of what we've picked, what's there available in the research. So to what extent are we seeing the software being developed in-house by organisations or contracted out to third-party providers? Because I think that gives rise to a whole series of, effectively you've got 3 parties now involved in a workplace in terms of the employer, the employee, and this third party providing that service. And
I think what we're finding, and the evidence is layers. So when we talked about call centres before and the level of monitoring and so forth, and that's overlaid then with AI and with other software technologies that looks at keystrokes, that looks at downtime, and starts to desegregate things. So it looks at it from the point of view of the customer interaction. A lot of customers are ringing up about this, and this much time has been spent on that. So if we restrict that or limit that, we can then, impact in terms of how we utilise the workers in those occasions. So we've all understood the frustrations of, I want to do this, and the system just won't let you do it. So you have to go and find another method, and usually it means you doing it yourself. So that leads to desegregation of roles in terms of looking at the roles and saying, well, we don't need the worker to do that anymore. We're stopping that, or we're forcing the customer to deal with that themselves.
Sure, okay, thank you. And Dr. O'Sullivan, just in terms of, like, as in from your research, to what extent is it being developed in-house versus the involvement of third parties in the provision of that software?
The simple answer, in Ireland, we don't know. And I suppose that would be the next stage for the FSU conversations with the employer. Internationally, that a lot of the software will be a third party, and that there'll be some level of customization with the employer. And that's why there is this question about, who's responsible. And that it's important that regulation, which it doesn't at the moment, well, we don't have regulation in Ireland, but internationally there's still not strong regulation about ensuring that the employer is responsible. There are some proposals that there should be joint liability, and that this might incentivise tech companies to ensure that their technology is compliant with national employment laws, that if they have joint responsibility or liability in the way in which GDPR does in some instances, that this might be a good thing for regulation to look at. But the answer is we don't know.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Deputy Matt Shannon, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. And thanks to the guests, and I think people have already said this is very timely. I think the difficulty that we have is that the rate of technology is changing so fast, and we're finding it impossible to keep up. And it's funny when we talk about people's privacy data, I'm on to my kids the whole time about these things. They're a tracking device, they have your biometrics in it, they have your retina scan, they have your fingerprints, and people are uploading all the personal data. It'll be not long before they'll have a DNA profile of people using phones as a security lock. That's kind of where things are going, and it's really difficult to see how we are going to push back on all of this without really almost draconian legislation, because particularly in the financial services sector, where so many people are using digital platforms, it is so easy to embed monitoring as part of performance reviews, as time clicks, number of customers approached. And I'm interested also in where you're talking about conversations being recorded in terms of banking performance, let's say, and we've seen the move in Irish banks to digitisation. It is ridiculous now that you can barely get a teller in a bank anymore, and very difficult for older people. But the banks have obviously done the metrics, and they've decided that's where the money is ultimately, to get to fully digitised platforms. But how we're going to stop or kind of arrest the development of all of this, I think is going to be very, very difficult. So I think your work is very, very timely. I also wonder, just in terms of the monitoring of company resources, and so if I take on a job and I'm given a phone and I'm given a laptop, the first question I should be asking myself is there software on this which is monitoring me? So if I go to any employer today, what right do I have to ask of an employer what monitoring systems are, let's say, in addition to what the phone has provided from Apple? What have you put on the phone that is monitoring me? What have you put in the laptop that is monitoring my time? Has an employee a right to seek that information, and can they get that information in a form that they can understand?
I suppose that's why we would argue in relation to workplace agreements and that being underpinned by collective bargaining, that power imbalance. Sure, if you're an employee and you have these concerns and so forth, and you're approaching your employer, there's a real power imbalance there. And legislation around collective bargaining to underpin people's right to be represented, and then to have these things trashed out on the basis of a workplace agreement. As Dr. Sullivan has outlined, co-governance is a feature in other countries. That shouldn't be a threat to employers. Co-governance around workplace policies will lead to better workplace policies, but it should initially lead to a clear understanding from employees of what's being monitored, and then that transparency piece in terms of people understanding the boundaries, and the boundaries being respected.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, but I just wonder in terms of, let's say, your computer's camera, for instance, right? So essentially, if we get into this idea of legislation, so in financial services, I'm sure that there's going to be large pushback from large financial concerns who say we need a certain amount of data profiling. We have to have it in terms of time spent, activity, accounts monitored, whatever it is. Otherwise, we can't monitor what our employees are doing, and we can't say whether you're doing a good job and you're not, because we don't know what metrics people are producing. Yeah. So we need all of that. But if someone is at home and they're being monitored in that way in the financial services centre, but cameras I would have a particular problem with, is the camera being used to record time? Is it recording people while they're moving around their houses? You know, these are kind of very significant questions, and I just think this is where legislation really needs to be targeting. You know, that there's a certain amount that's going to happen, and it's already happening. And then just in terms of AI, how is AI being used to supplement this this monitoring that you're talking about? You're saying that we all know that AI and ChatGPT and how that's being used, and we've seen it being used in government departments here on a trial basis, but how is it being used to effect greater monitoring of employees?
On the first one, on the, for example, remote work, I think there's you're talking about different types of monitoring. So like the webcams, so for example, I mean, there's a long history of sort of, say, decisions from the Data Protection Commissioner and that on video surveillance in the workplace. But I'm not aware of it in terms of remote work. But other systems then, regardless of what the system is, a key issue is the legitimacy and the proportionality. So is the technology being used for a legitimate purpose? But more than that, about proportionality, a lot of international regulation, our proposals about regulation would say that a key issue is that the employer must show that they couldn't use less intrusive methods. So they have to justify why a particular method is being used to record what employees do. And if they're using things like videos or biometrics or whatever, they have to explain why they couldn't use something less intrusive to achieve the same objective. So proportionality is a key issue there. In terms of artificial intelligence, in some organisations they don't use it at all, and in other organisations, the ones that are putting more money into technology and surveillance, they might be using it to develop, like for example, the scorecards. Particularly in some organisations internationally, there is a level of almost complete automation where some employees in some organisations would, for example, be terminated purely on the basis of an algorithm saying that they've had X number of transgressions. We don't know, but I don't suspect that level of use is that widespread yet. More what we have is an assistance level of artificial intelligence where it's helping management to make decisions, but management are still at the moment being the key decision makers. They're using AI to develop data about the level of employees' work or the quantity or the quality. But at the moment, I think humans are still making the key decisions, or they have the ability to override what AI might be telling them. But the potential for that data to be used in the future can go further.
Well, I'd say it probably is the case, and I imagine it is in financial services, that a qualitative score, let's say, in terms of people's interaction with technology is part of an employee review. If it's in terms of business activity, all of that, that's not something you're going to take out or manage very easily. Just in terms of, you said that the European Commission are looking at potentially a new AI bill. Do you know what the scope of that is? Where is that pointed? What are they trying to encapsulate in that, you know?
Yeah, it's not specific to employment, it's AI in general. So it's they have a draft AI regulation, or the AI Act as it's called. I suppose the weakness that law technology experts internationally would say that it's very much about getting developers of technology to assess the extent to which that they are transparent in the way in which that they work and fair in which the way they work, but that it's not specific to employment. Even though it mentions that its use in employment is high risk, it places very little emphasis on what employers should be doing, and very little mention, if anything at all, on workers or workers' rights. So there's a lot of gaps with that. So it's I suppose the strongly held view internationally is that that will not be strong enough in its present form to be able to protect workers in the workplace or give guidance to employers even in the workplace in terms of artificial intelligence.
I think safe to say, Chair, that 1984 is, 2024 is now 1984, potentially. That's where we've gotten to. That's me done, thanks.
Yeah, next person, Senator Paul Gavin.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks to our guests. I really think this is one of the most important meetings that we've held because huge credit to Dr. O'Sullivan and her team in terms of the level of research conducted and the findings. And I just want to read a couple of the quotes from that research into the record because they are just so stark. Everything you type is being recorded in instant messaging. Another one, up the line they want oversight of everything. Centralisation of tasks brings control. Automation brings control. And then just a third one, sales targets in the biggest things like mortgage products are crazy, are unattainable, and that adds pressure to you when technology breaks down. That takes time out of your day. My first job was in a call centre a long time ago, and we had a lot of monitoring then. I do remember colleagues being called out to be effectively disciplined because they were spending too long talking to customers on calls and so on and so forth. And yes, tone can be important, as David has said, but to be frank, the level of micromanagement in those call centres, even then, was quite frightening. I happened to have an occasion to ring an insurance company just yesterday, and my heart went out to the person I was dealing with in terms of the desperation they had at the end of the call to say to me, will you please give me a good review when you get the email through? Can you think about the pressures that young people are facing? You've mentioned a power imbalance. And the elephant in the room here, in my opinion, is the fact that, co-governance, for example, as Dr. O'Sullivan has raised, that only works if workers have an actual right to collective bargaining. And this country, 100 years after independence, remains an outlier, and that we don't have a right to collective bargaining. You mentioned the importance of accessing for trade unions, accessing employers. I'll declare an interest. I was a trade union official. So, my view is I believe in workers' rights. It was incredibly hard when I was a trade union official to access employers when they didn't want you there. So, I'd ask the guests just to just deal with that issue of the elephant in the room, the fact that we don't have collective bargaining rights, because all of the concerns that all of us have expressed here this morning won't actually be meaningful unless we address that power imbalance. Without that power imbalance being addressed, we're kidding ourselves. And clearly, we're heading in a very dark direction right now. So how do we fix the issue of collective bargaining, and how urgent a task is it given this report?
I think, Deputy, it's an extremely urgent issue for workers in terms of being able to have those conversations with the workplace changing so fast. AI is one aspect of it, but as Dr. O'Sullivan has said, digitisation in the sector, the use of analytics, and so forth. So the issue of collective bargaining, there's two important developments that we would seek support from the Oireachtas. One is the minimum wage directive coming from Europe, which is going to set a target of 80% collective bargaining for each member state. And that has to be, I suppose, embraced, not just adhered to. It needs to be embraced in terms of recognising that collective bargaining leads to a stable society and to fairer society. And the second piece is good faith bargaining, which equally has come through the LEAF subcommittee of government and employers and trade unions, and that equally is coming forward, I believe, before the end of the year. So those are two really important developments that require the support of the full Oireachtas in terms of getting us to the starting blocks in terms of collective bargaining. And then it is about permeating it down on issues like this, where workers and their representatives have access, and not just physical access. Digital access now for our members is a huge issue. We've had collective meetings of 1,200 people online, on screen, in terms of issues and that. So digital access and physical access are two key elements of building a society where workers can highlight issues like these without fear or favour, and knowing that they're going to be addressed by their employer in a responsible way. And that would start to rebalance that power imbalance that we talk about.
So those 2 points I think are really important. I have a concern, and the concern is, I mean, we had the Enterprise Department in just 2 weeks ago with the Minister in, talking about the Works Council Directive, which, as you know, has been really appallingly inscribed here. It's useless, effectively, for workers. And the attitude of the Minister was there's nothing to see here. So how much confidence would you have that those key points, particularly that minimum wage directive, because there's a great tradition in this country of implementing EU directives on workers' rights in the most minimalist way possible, so that workers' rights aren't actually enhanced. Are you concerned, or are you confident that the government will actually deliver as they should do in relation to that directive?
I think they have to, and I think the mood music has changed. I think we have, the President of our own country, the President of the United States, all publicly saying that the recognition of workers and the recognition of trade union and collective bargaining is a key tenet of a civil society. So I don't think there is an option, and I don't think we can adopt a minimalist approach. I think we have to adopt an approach that actually goes for the target of 80% collective bargaining. I think we'd have a fairer society as an output of that. And given the challenges that our society is facing, we see it on a daily basis in terms of societal issues. Workers are at the stage where they believe that they are entitled to, fair representation. We've had it across the tech sector recently in terms of redundancies, where they've turned to us in terms of their representation. So I think it's a key issue, and one that really needs to be grasped by the Oireachtas.
Yeah, I want to pay tribute in particular to the FSU, because I think you're a great example of a union that really does go out to support workers and address their needs directly. And I think it's a huge credit to you in terms of the way that your own union is growing. And I just want to finish, Chair, by saying I really do think we need to support a report being written by this committee to really follow through on the excellent work of FSU and Dr. O'Sullivan and her team. Thanks indeed.
Senator Gavin, Deputy.
Thanks very much. Just one or two brief questions. Again, I want to join with Senator Gavin in again congratulating you on the work that you've done on this, and the responsible approach you've taken to it, and the leadership you've given here. It's really important. Dr. O'Sullivan, you mentioned interlogical surveillance, I think, earlier on when you were speaking. Could you, am I correct? Oh, I thought you said interlogical. I'm sorry. Okay, that's all right. That's okay. I misheard. I just wanted to be clear. Could you also mentioned a topic that we're also interested in, that is bullying. And I think you asked whether or not surveillance in some shape or form would have an impact on bullying in a negative or positive way. I think if I heard you correctly, you said 11% of people said it helped. I'm interested in the extent of bullying that's going on that you might have come across, either informally or formally. Obviously, hopefully, not everybody is impacted by bullying. We would hope that it's at a very low level. But if 11% of people felt that they were helped by surveillance or by monitoring because of in a bullying situation, that's interesting, I think, as well. And finally, the final question I want to ask is getting back to AI, and it's a small bit off the theme here, but we've been told that AI has the potential to have a massive impact on employment and jobs in certain areas, in particular maybe in the banking area, as we've said already. I wonder whether you have any views on that, or whether or not you've planned to do any work on that, or whether you've done any work on that. I know it's moving so quickly now, but it's something that I'm quite concerned about, the impact of jobs. I know there are positives to it, like everything else, but it's just something I think we need to keep an eye on as well. Thank you.
Thank you. In relation to the bullying, I mean, there's a number of areas where research would suggest that there's benefits to surveillance. That's in relation to, for example, bullying, productivity, the idea that you might have a more accurate, an accurate measure of employees' performance. So we asked people in the survey about those things, but low proportions would have agreed with the statement, those benefits. So less than a fifth would have agreed that technological surveillance does provide an accurate measure of performance that leads to more fair decisions, and that helps with bullying. We don't know, I mean, bullying wasn't the focus of this, so I don't know the prevalence of it, and John might have a greater sense of it in banking. I know in other studies that we've done, for example, in nursing, it's quite significant. My colleague, Dr. Sarah McCurtain, would have done a larger study on incivility and bullying in Ireland, which would show quite significant levels in certain sectors more than others. Financial services, for example, and the health sector would be one of those areas, particularly with customer interactions as well, because there can be quite difficult jobs. So it's an area of unknown, particularly with regard to remote working, because on the one hand you could argue that it should help with bullying because you might have less contact with people who might be the source of bullying. On the other hand, you could say that people are more isolated in remote work, and then it might lead to increased bullying because of their isolation. So we don't know enough about that area yet.
Okay, thank you.
Just to complement that, again, we have done studies in terms of stress at work, which has scored very high in the financial services sector, and the Irish Bank and Culture Board, of which I'm a member of, also have done surveys which showed, you know, over the period of the surveys over a number of years, that it continues to be an issue for workers in the sector. And one of the key issues that comes across to us is work intensification. So it's that, you know, and it comes with surveillance or monitoring and that oversight piece of that feeling of work intensification, that you have to do certain things because you are being monitored, or there's, you know, analytics being developed in terms of what's occurring. So work intensification is a huge issue for us in the sector. And in fairness to the workers in the financial services, overnight they transitioned to being remote workers, and now there's a hybrid element for lots of them. There's still a lot of workers working remotely, and that is something that people value in terms of, you know, new ways of working. But it's that work intensification piece of the expectations, you know, the quotes in the report show in terms of the ask continually increasing in terms of particularly around sales, and that previously led to bad things in banking when that went unchecked. So that would be a concern in terms of.
And the AI bit, if you have a comment on that. Sorry.
No.
In terms of the AI bit, again, just...
I was talking about the impact on employment and...
Yeah, so there are forecasts in terms of it. We think properly managed, it can complement. Yes, jobs will change, but jobs are changing. It's how it changes. And that's been our argument in terms of the financial services sector, and particularly digitisation. It's not that we're opposed to change, it's how change comes about. And we saw communities being left behind in terms of branch closures, and we saw communities who pushed back when they were told that you didn't want cash in your community and so forth. So I think it's how the change comes about, and this is no different, except that it's an extremely fast-paced change, and it seems to be that it's like the Wild West, that there are no rules. And it's to get to a situation where we have a sheriff in town and it is regulated properly to protect workers and consumers as well, I would suggest.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I think just to come back in here, just that there's a lot of key findings in the report, but I think one of them that stands out to me is that over half the respondents didn't know that they were being monitored, or there was any surveillance taking part, whether it's on their home computer or their work computer. And that goes back to the collective bargaining element of it, that those discussions should happen prior to anything going on their computer or on their phone with the trade union movement. I think that's the important element, and it comes back to that collective bargaining element of it. The other part of it is, and Dr. O'Sullivan mentioned, this is one of the first pieces of research that in Ireland on this issue. And that's why we feel it's really important. Today is really important. And that's why we were asking the committee that if they could commission a report into this, because we do need to know what's happening out there. There is a lack of data and a lack of knowledge of what's happening with employers, where the data has been stored and so forth. So that's why I think it's really important if the committee could agree to commission a report into this and to get the employers in and to find out exactly where data has been stored, what data is being stored, how long it's been stored for, and also obviously for those discussions to happen prior to anything happening with the trade union movement. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, Senator McCarrick first, and then you can come.
Thanks, Chair. And I suppose in your recommendations, there's obviously a series of calls with regards to legislative change, and I appreciate that you're asking this committee to in some ways detail that. But I just want to tease a little bit more out I think we're very clear that, you know, in terms of Ireland not having a right to be recognised for collective bargaining purposes, that obviously needs to be changed, and that framework is going to change now because of the EU directive. But that in itself obviously won't be sufficient in some ways in improving worker power within organisations. So in terms of that right to organise, so that you then have that co-determination with regards to surveillance policies and whatever else. From the FSU's perspective, are there other legislative changes, particularly in the bullying harassment sphere or in other complementary pieces of legislation that we need to get that right to organise, to get that right to collective bargaining right when that EU directive comes in?
Yeah, I think for us, one of the key aspects, aside from the legislation to enshrine collective bargaining as a right, is around, you know, real access, and as I said, physical access, so that people can go and visit workers in their workplace, but equally that digitally we can go and visit workers in the workplace and know that those conversations are private conversations in terms of the dialogue that would take place. You know, we are a successful country in terms of the economics and so forth. It's how do we, you know, enshrine that and embed that going forward. And one of the best ways we believe is through legislating for collective bargaining, but also creating that workplace environment where workers, you know, feel that empowerment that you talk about, that they feel it's okay to improve the workplace by highlighting issues like the use of AI, like the use of digitization and so forth, and how that's impacting on that and on them. And as again, we would stress, we're not opposed to change. We're not even opposed to AI, but it has to be used in a context that's for the benefit of consumers and for staff, and used in a way that's ethical. Like there are countries like Australia developing ethical AI frameworks and so forth. There's issues around, you know, copyright and so forth that the music industry is lobbying hard on and so forth. So there's many aspects of this, but for us, the issues of access, enshrining a right to collectively bargain for workers, and that's, you know, recognised and supported by the state.
Sure.
Okay. So just on a connected point, the WRC, as you know, have a consultation out now on remote working, flexible working. And obviously remote working comes into this. It's intertwined right to the disconnect we spoke about before. They are all intertwined, because when you're coming out, when you're in your workplace, when you're physically in your workplace and you're in front of your computer on your phone and you get the messages that this message has been, you know, it's a little different when you're sitting maybe perhaps at home and you're maybe, you know, you're sitting in your bedroom if you're in a one-bedroom apartment, or you're in your box room or whatever. And so it's, you know, these are all intertwined, and there's a consultation process out now, as you know, on flexible and remote working, and perhaps that we would feel that surveillance at home in particular of your computer or of your phone and so forth should be part of that code and should be included in that code. I think that would be worthwhile exploring that.
Okay, and thank you. And I suppose just in terms of picking up on the other pieces of legislative change then that is required. So I think we've talked about, you know, data protection obviously is really important. health and safety, I think, is perhaps an area as well. And are there other legislative areas that we need to look at here? Like, I'm thinking for instance, this discussion also touches into the growth of platform work, and we have seen this, the enormous use of AI there to allow, to facilitate the growth of platform work. But I suppose the demand as well, that like is in, there's a right to an explanation with regards to algorithmic change and how it's designed and all that. So there are other legislative areas that maybe I haven't thought of there that we need to be looking at in the context of our committee's deliberations.
Yeah, I think you're talking about numbers like the privacy, the health and safety is correct. Whether the technology should be used at all as part of monitoring or surveillance of employees. That I think particularly important is the stages in which rights kick in.
Yes.
Because a lot of rights at the moment in terms of data protection might be, after the fact as opposed to before the thing's developed at all. And that some legislation internationally would say that worker representatives should have a lot of input in terms of the development stage of that no technology should be introduced before they are involved. I mean, we asked the employees in the survey about their level of influence over workplace policies on technology, introduction to technology, and 3/4 of respondents said they had no influence at all. And research shows that if people are influenced, that they are more likely to be accepting of technology and technology related to surveillance. So that's a big issue as well. Definitely, I mean, the platform economy is one where they have a very sophisticated level of algorithm management. I mean, the EU is bringing in a directive on platform work. Some of that is instructive on, they have, part of that directive is about the use of algorithms, and even though it's specific to platform work, some of that is instructive about how it could be applied in other workplaces as well, in terms of the proportionality and so on of AI.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
And thanks again to the guests. Just one final question. I think we're probably all getting to the point that we understand really what's required as legislation here. But could you just outline, if you've done any work around this, who should actually be the final arbiter of deciding what monitoring or surveillance should take place in terms of employees across different work platforms? Like, where would that responsibility lie? And I suppose secondly, have we actually got the technological capability in the public administration to really get into the kernel of these issues and understand what it is we're trying to legislate for?
Well, I think some of the legislation models that would rely on co-determination and co-governance would say that technology shouldn't be implemented, that it has to be an agreed one, particularly in particularly where there's an absence of law on the issue. That's a question, I suppose, that hasn't been answered yet about, I think, the question that you're asking. And there would be, the difficulty with answering a question like that is that companies themselves, particularly if they're buying in the software, they won't necessarily know how the algorithm works if they're using it to a sophisticated level. And neither will the employees, and even with the level of training, you couldn't necessarily expect that they would understand the technical aspects of how technology would work, the algorithms would work. So you have to say, well, regardless of that, then what is it that any arbiter is deciding? I think for any kind of arbiter to decide on making decisions on the technical aspects and what the technical bits should and shouldn't be allowed to do would be quite difficult. Because, like I said, the employers might not be able to answer that question. So then you have to say, well, regardless of the technical aspects, well, what kind of rights should employees have regardless? And should there even be a level of monitoring, technological monitoring of their works? That's the first question. And then you have varying levels of flexibility after that, if they're allowed.
And do you think that would kind of radiate across sectors? So could you have, I think it's going to be very hard to come to a kind of a blanket position here, because different sectors are going to have different requirements and they're going to argue for different requirements in monitoring. So I suppose it's trying to understand, if you're trying to legislatively underpin, and I accept that the kind of cooperative agreement is the best agreement if you can find, if everybody can agree. But it's very unlikely that you're going to get total agreement across different sectors. Some employers are going to demand that they need to have certain levels of monitoring, which some employee groups will probably find intrusive. And the question is, I suppose, who is best, or how best are we going to arrive at an understanding around that? Is it going to be individual sectoral bargaining? Is it? And I think one of the questions about big tech is that's the thing we're all afraid of. You know, it's probably easier to do some kind of determination on small tech and to try and manage those guys. But the big tech stuff is really hard to manage, and it's not even based here anyway. So technically speaking, some of the legislation might be overridden by legislation where those companies are incorporated.
Well, I think some of the proposals by, for example, there are some good proposals by law experts internationally, like Valerio De Stefano and Jeremiah Prassel, and they would say actually in the area of employment that there's more scope for more specific regulation in the area of employment than if you're talking about AI in society in general. Because legislation can be quite specific. For example, if you take the equality legislation, it's quite specific in terms of, the rules by which people should be treated in the workplace. So you can get to a level of specificity. But a lot of the legislation which is specific to AI so far would put a lot of emphasis on trying to let workers and employers together sort it out, because there may be specifics in particular sectors and that they haven't been overly specific. Some of them have, blanket bans in some areas, but where there is flexibility, they've legislated that it should be workers and employers together rather than a unilateral decision making. But after that, then, what is it that you're asking an arbiter to do? That's something I think that would be up for discussion, I think, as to what kind of questions, what kind of complaints an arbiter would be asked to look at. I think that would be up for discussion.
That's it. Thanks. That sounds very much simple.
Deputy Bruton.
Sorry, I had to go to another meeting, so I don't want to be repeating it. So don't answer if it's a repeat. But I'm just interested to know, like, what are the sort of precedents for proportionality in this sphere? Like, I know obviously an employer has to monitor for some illegal activity that could occur on their network, and there's legitimate oversight of work. But are there good models for distinguishing, what the principles, even in a negotiated settlement, might be? And I'll add to that, I just think of recruitment. You could have, I'm sure already happening, AI sorting through applications for jobs. God only knows what biases are built into, the algorithms that they're using to select. Where is that heading? Or, does equality legislation apply to those sort of sifting processes that no doubt are happening when loads of CVs go in? And, I'd be interested to hear what ought we be starting to think about as regulators in this sphere.
There are some good proposals internationally about that, about what proportionality means, and there are some principles that have been developed. For example, that employers couldn't use or shouldn't use technology to provide an answer which couldn't credibly be answered by technology. So, for example, if an organisation uses technology to do a 30-second recording of an individual, and based on those 30 seconds that an algorithm would decide whether someone is suitable for a job or not, that wouldn't be credible for them to do that. So there are principles which are being proposed which could help with those issues around proportionality. But I think
profiling, scraping around looking for stuff, is that legitimate? Or
in terms of people's backgrounds and so on. Yeah, I mean, I think the difficulty at the moment is that because we're generally regulation is so far behind internationally, is that people had an assumption that AI would be biased, and of course lots of research now shows that equality legislation is useful, but that we now know, of course, that the information being fed into systems in recruitment is itself biased, and therefore the algorithmic management systems are themselves biased. So we know, for example, from research that AI systems are more than likely to pick up to, for example, select men for certain types of jobs because they're picking up on particular words that men are more likely to use in CVs than women are. And that's because of the information that they're being fed and what they're looking for. So, of course, legislation is only useful if people know and can identify the source of the problem to begin with. And because the complexity of AI systems, we don't know what they're deciding or what information they're being fed. So that's why the issue of people being involved at the development stages of a technology being introduced in the workplace is important, rather than after they've made a decision when it's too late to kind of know what is being done. But there are very useful proposals, and I'm happy to forward on any that might be useful to the committee.
I think it does seem so far-reaching potentially, where the potential use of personal data, profiling people, going into people's private lives to decide suitability for promotion. Like it's a minefield. So I don't know where we can stick our oar in to try to guide the boat. But no, thanks for the work. It's very thought-provoking.
I think, Deputy, that's why we were saying in the first instance our request to the committee is to consider a report, to know the extent of it, and that, looking across and broader than recruitment, looking at performance and so forth, and understanding the extent of it that's currently at play, and then where it goes, where the potential for it to go, in terms of the extent, the algorithms, the impact, and so forth. So we're saying we don't have all the answers. We're saying that from a worker's perspective, this is us doing an extensive study over a number of years, and in terms of it, see the potential, both good and bad, into the future, and I suppose are asking the committee to unpeel it a bit and look into it and see what is the extent of it, have employers in to talk about this, and how do they self-regulate currently, and what level of transparency is there currently, and then that should start to guide us in terms of the direction of travel for legislation.
Senator Gavin, you want to come in?
Yeah, look, I just want to reference a note that I've been given in relation to this topic, and again, I suppose to read it into the record, ask for a response as well, to see is it accurate, frankly. Are you aware of an AI data collection tool called Workplace Activity Data Utility, or WADU for short? This AI tool, it's alleged, monitors workers' activity and body language through cameras in the office space to deduce their performance, their attention, their focus, whether they are sad, stressed, happy, and so forth, and the data is provided to managers. Additionally, the system allegedly monitors online activity from what the worker watches, as well as recording them through the camera and microphone on a work-issued device. I'm told that this device was specifically built for one of the major banks, I won't name the bank, Chair, and has been covered, the topic's been covered on several occasions by Business Insider. So I don't know if I don't think it's worth just highlighting that and just seeing is there a response from our guests.
Science fiction gone mad.
Maybe so, yeah.
I haven't heard of that specific one, but I mean, that wouldn't be unusual in terms of the type of softwares that are being developed. I mean, the American website I mentioned earlier, Coworker, has about a list of 550 apps which can be used to monitor all aspects.
550?
Yeah, and they're developing this, they're adding to the database all the time. Now, it's mostly American concentrated. But the level of information, that potentially could be used is limitless. I mean, there are extreme examples, and not all employers. It does take a significant level of resources by companies to develop technology. I mean, what we would have found in our FSU study is actually for a lot of the employers, they're putting probably more money into the customer-facing technology than they are into the background systems that employees can use. And actually, that's a hindrance for employees in terms of it. But the potential is there for these kinds of, that's not unusual in terms of the kinds of apps that are available. But of course, they can develop these and employers can use them in the absence of regulation or collective agreement.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Anybody else? Okay, so that concludes our consideration of this matter today. So I want to thank all the representatives for assisting the committee in this consideration of this important matter. And the committee will further, as everyone has agreed, will further consider this matter as soon as possible. So that concludes the committee's business in public session for today. And I propose we go into private session. Is that agreed? That's agreed. Thank you.
Chairman, thank you for allowing us to present here today and for deliberation.
You're more than welcome. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.